But it's from this very point on top of a hill where this small village actually started that I'm going to tell you the story of Columbus. People from the Canary Islands, they believe, came from Africa, from an area they call like the Berber or the Amazon area. So I'm standing on the top floor of the Casa de Colon, what they call it. It's actually the governor's house. It is massive inside and really, really beautiful. You can even get higher and see more of the city. An amazing view of the entire town if you come upstairs. Makes it worth the price. What I would call kind of the Venus of the Canaries. And you can see injuries on this mummy. We also have some painted caves here with this beautiful styling in the back. Come with me today on an incredible voyage to the place where Columbus and his 3 ships actually landed for the first time on his first voyage to the New World on this island. No, it's nowhere in the Caribbean. It's off the coast of Africa. I am on Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands, and right behind me is the actual church where Columbus prayed. Let's figure out what this island had to do with the journeys of Christopher Columbus and what this means for the rediscovery of the New World. In the waning days of August of 1492, the Atlantic Ocean heaved under a sky vast and uncharted, with 3 modest ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, cutting through its cerulean depths. So this city, Las Palmas, Real de Tres Palmas, or Las Palmas as it's now called, actually grew up kind of in synchronicity with the cities of the New World. It was barely an outpost at the time when Columbus landed here, but at the same time that the capitals of the New World, like Santo Domingo and San Juan and Puerto Rico were growing up, so was this. Most of these buildings that you see around here were on the outside of the wall that was here when Columbus was here. So they're built in the subsequent years. So in some ways you can consider this a New World city, just like Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, just like one of the new cities established in Mexico. The Museo Canario, which means the Canary Museum or the Canary Islands Museum, is their main museum. It's primarily an archaeological museum, and it promises to give us a good start in understanding these Canary Islands. So let's take a walk through these ancient streets. The Canary Museum with no canaries inside. And in case you didn't catch it already, the Canary Islands are not islands full of yellow Tweety bird canaries. They were actually named the Canary Islands because canary is a word kind of like dog in Latin, so they were considered island of the dogs. So the Canary Museum, or the Museo Canario, is a really good place to start if you want to understand a little bit about the history of these islands. Behind me is a recreation of how the natives would have lived. They had their dwellings inside the cliffs, which they modified. As soon as you walk into this museum, in the first room, you're going to see that model, and then another model of one of their circular dwellings, which was mainly made of stone, with wooden slats over the top and then mud over that. So interestingly, very reminiscent of what you've seen on this channel if you watch some of the other videos about the history of Europe. So some major similarities there, even though the people from the Canary Islands were not European. The indigenous people from the Canary Islands, they believe, came from Africa, from an area they call like the Berber or the Amazon area. And they had been here since probably about 500 BCE, so a very, very long time before the Europeans started conquering them in 1300 something, but it wasn't really conquered very well until the 1400s. By the time Columbus came here, Gran Canaria was completely conquered. But prior to that, let's see a little bit how they lived. Here we have a lot of mills because they were grinding food. We have lots of examples of mortars and pestles. We have a small mill here. So they used the materials that were around. We also see some of that red ochre that you've seen in some of my other videos, very popular cross-culturally. A lot of sharpened rocks. We have basalt and obsidian. So of course my very first question was, what did they eat? What were they grinding? Well, when I think of grinding right away I think of corn, but they weren't grinding corn. They were grinding wheat and barley. They also ate figs, and they also had some legumes. And in addition to that, they did have some animals that they domesticated or had already domesticated and cultivated. They obviously used for meat and also for skins, and that's mainly the sheep, the goat, and the pig. They also ate seafood, and there's a really gross exhibit here. One of the reasons they knew that they ate seafood and that certain people were fishermen was because there's something called exostosis, which is an abnormal growth of a bone inside their ear. So they know that people were basically underwater being exposed to cold water a lot because they had a weird growth in their ear, and it appeared differently on males than it did on females. So some kind of funky, interesting fact. As we move into another room, we get to see some pretty amazing sights because much like the painted caves of Lascaux, which were a bit more elaborate, but remember there was more cross-cultural traveling there. We also have some painted caves here with this beautiful styling in the back. So if you come here to the Gran Canaries, one of the top sites that you can see are the painted caves, and they have a recreation of it right here in the Canary Museum. It looks just like the real thing. Another interesting thing that the natives, which are called the Canary, had on Gran Canaria is they had stamps, all kinds of stamps. So what do you mean stamps? Like were they stamping paper? No, but they were stamping their face and their body parts most likely. All these different kinds of intricate little stamps that probably showed status or wealth or belief or something of that nature. And we also have what I would call kind of the Venus of the Canaries. We also have this sculpture. It's pretty big. It's a lot bigger than the Venus of Dolny Vestonica, a lot bigger than the Venus of Willendorf. Of course, it's a lot more recent if you're talking about the actual age, but perhaps not if we're talking about the development of the society. But it's very interesting, as we see with many of the Venuses, since the emphasis is on fertility, they actually had this prenuptial, so this pre-marriage ritual where they would fatten the bride. So this might be related to that. It's very fattened, with really big thighs, really big boobs. So we're emphasizing fertility, we're emphasizing fecundity, we're emphasizing almost like an engorgement or an abundance. And the head is the tiniest head and eyes I've ever seen. So like a third of the size of her boobs is her head. So it shows you what they were focusing on. But we also have one that shows woman's hair. So there's a lot of emphasis on the woman's hair in this particular sculpture. And that's very interesting too, because here we're in the previous Venus, we're looking at exaggerated kind of genital or feminine type body parts with no head, and then all of a sudden we have this lavish hair. So that might have been associated with a particular woman of a particular social value, maybe a particular spiritual value. Very interesting room in here. This museum has 2 floors, so once you get upstairs you get to see some of the other things that they made. They had a kind of leather that they made mostly using goat skin for the leather. They also made a lot of their items out of rush, which is a kind of a reed, and you can see that now behind me here. So we have leather made from goats and other animals that they had. We have baskets and different types of containers made from reeds. We also have ceramic pottery. It was here before the Europeans. And we also have clothing made of palm trees. So the city is called Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. They must have had palm trees because they have clothing made from palm trees, even in the indigenous times. Now let's go to the next room and check out something that creates a similarity with Egypt. Like so many cultures we've studied before, the natives of the Canary Islands had very elaborate burial processes. This is a recreation right here of a burial mound. Remember, we've seen some of the oldest burial mounds in the world on this channel, in Ireland, in Scotland, places like that. Although these really don't have a connection to those same people, as this was an isolated island, we see some really similar ideas. They also have some skeletons over here, and it gives us a little bit of an idea of what was going on. At the time of the conquest, we see some skeletons that are very damaged, and it does not look like battle wounds. We see multiple fractures in the head, we see fractures in the hip, in the pelvis. It looks almost like some sort of punishment rather than battle wounds, according to the scientists that analyze these. So not a pretty picture when Europeans come upon this land. Here we have a baby mummy. Which brings us to our next topic, the mummies. Like the Egyptians, although I'm not aware of any connection, except that they're both from Africa, the native Canary Island people mummified their dead. And apparently they mummified all their dead. So it wasn't just a class thing, although I'm sure different classes were treated differently. But so we have examples of mummies, which is pretty amazing. This is a male, I believe, between 25 and 30 years old right here, the biggest one they have. And you can see injuries on this mummy. You can see head fractures. They think this one might have been involved in a suicide ritual where he jumped off a hill, or some sort of other task where he was proving himself, like carrying a log up to a location where there couldn't be a log, which would be a very honorable thing to do. Maybe he died during it, or maybe he didn't. Maybe he fractured his skull during it. But at some point he was mummified like this. If you're into ceramics, clay pottery, there's tons of examples here from all the different islands. You had to have somewhere to put all your grain and to keep it. This island has different microclimates, by the way. The southern half is mostly like a desert, and the northern half gets more rain, and the center gets the most rain. Okay, so I'm going to say goodbye for now to the wonderful mummy collection here at the Museo Canario. We've learned a little bit about what life was like here before Columbus and the Spanish got here. Now, we're going to learn what it was like when Columbus got here. It had already been colonized. It was already a cute little Spanish port. We're going to go see the Columbus house and the cathedral where Columbus would have prayed. Remember, this backdrop of the Canary Islands is really important to the history of the discovery of the New World. Because the Canary Islands, although they're part of Spain, are worlds away from Spain. They're kind of a prototype for what would happen in the New World. It wasn't long before that the Canary Islands were these newly discovered islands where the people and the resources were heavily exploited by the European powers. This template would go on to reproduce itself, and what better springboard than the sugar and slave port of the Canary Islands to create this kind of transatlantic trade monopoly in the New World, which would basically be the result of the discovery. Thought he was going to get spices from India, but ended up creating an even richer situation for Europe in the sugar, tobacco, and slave trade. So right where I'm standing right now was the place where the Spanish establishment was first set up. It was a ravine with water and palm trees, so it was a good military point. This city really quiets down after the cruise ships go back. So earlier today, these squares were much more crowded, and now it's like a quiet little medieval town. Not exactly medieval, after medieval, but it's got that vibe. Right now I'm in the Pasaje Pedro de Algaba. It's really just one of those cities that you could spend a good day just wandering around its hundreds of year old alleyways. The old neighborhood is called La Vegueta, with a V, La Vegueta. This door says abogado, lawyer. I wonder how long a lawyer has been living there. Could have been hundreds of years, a lawyer's office. Perhaps a similar color is the house that the governor lived in, where Christopher Columbus would have spent the night if he chose to actually sleep on land rather than on his ship. I personally think he probably would have. It probably would have been nice to sleep on land a little bit. But remember that the crew was perhaps mutinous and grouchy, and some of them might not really have wanted to go on this adventure, so it might have been a good idea for Columbus to actually sleep on his ship as a way of protecting the ship from being sunk or sabotaged. Right behind me, this facade is all that's left of the Columbus house here in the Gran Canary Islands. But it's from this very point on top of a hill where this small village actually started that I'm going to tell you the story of Columbus in Gran Canaria. It doesn't look exactly as it would have at the time of Columbus, but it has some of the remaining elements, so I will take you inside where you'll get a little bit more of the history of Christopher Columbus and the Canary Islands. So I'm standing on the top floor of the Casa de Colon, what they call it. It's actually the governor's house. Inside this room, they've actually done a really good job of showing the main question that I always have, which is, what did the city look like back then? What did it look like in the time of Columbus? And what did it look like a couple hundred years ago? Well, perfect example right here. Nothing like what the historic district looks like today. This beautiful model that they've done shows us that at the time that Columbus came here, it was a really, really tiny little, I mean, it's even a stretch to say village. You can see the church that I told you about where Columbus prayed. It's still standing today in a really similar form. And tiny little city walls. So this is it. This is the village that existed at the time of Columbus. They've also done a great job of showing about 200 years later. So Columbus was here in 1492 the first time, although he stopped through here on many of his voyages. First time was in 1492. It had just been conquered about 8 or 9 years prior. Tiny little village. Fast forward 200 years to 1686, and they've done another great model of the city, Las Palmas de Gran Canaria, or El Real de Las Palmas, which was the original name. And you can see what it looked like 200 years later. But yeah, now it's called Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. Back at the time, it was called El Real de Las Palmas, the royal city of the palms. So this is how much the city grew 200 years after Columbus. There's that river still there in the middle. Remember, they called it the City of the Palms because a marker of the city was 3 palms that looked almost intertwined. Now, why is it called the Casa de Colon? Well, first of all, it was here, in part, at the time that Christopher Columbus came here. It was not his house. He didn't grow up here. It was actually the governor's house. And it is believed that the governor would have offered accommodation to Christopher Columbus. He may have actually slept here, although we can't prove it. But he most certainly would have come here and had chats, talks, tea, drinks, whatever they would have had at the time with the governor. Remember, it was a very, very small city at the time and very few buildings in existence. Now, this particular courtyard probably has elements that existed at the time of Columbus, but most of this Casa de Colon, the governor's house, actually has been built in later eras. So you can see different elements that perhaps would have existed at the time of Columbus, but the actual house as it existed at the time of Columbus has been pretty much built over. You can't see exactly where he lived at. What it is now is a museum, and they do a really nice job. Basically what they did when they created the museum was they took a bunch of houses and put them all together. You can see what it would have been like living here over the centuries. Unfortunately, you don't get to see a cute little house that Columbus lived in for 6 months. You know, he was only here for a short time while he was fixing the rudder, getting some rest. He might have even slept on his own ship. But this museum actually does a really nice job. Not only do they recreate where he slept on his ship, which if you've been following my videos, you saw when I went to Palos de la Frontera and went on the replicas of all of his ships. But they actually do a really good job of explaining all the routes that he took, the different places that he stopped, the different places that he discovered on each voyage. So it is apt to call this the House of Columbus or the Casa de Colon because you learn so much here about Christopher Columbus and his journeys. And you also learn about the Canary Islands and how it was connected. Now keep in mind, the Canaries, it's very interesting, the guide was telling me, the Canary accent is actually a little bit more similar to Latin America. And this could have been because they're so far from Spain that they might share more affinities with Latin America. They don't pronounce the Z like in Spain. They'll pronounce the Z like a th. They don't do that in Canary Islands. Of course, they don't do that in Mexico and Argentina. So it's more similar to Latin American in different senses. They have a softer J than they do in Spain. So a lot of similarities between not only what happened in the Canary Islands and what happened in the Americas. Remember, the Canary Islands had been conquered in the 1400s, barely before the conquest of the Americas. But not only was the procedure similar, but the people nowadays are still similar, if in none other than the way they speak. So this is all you get as far as where Columbus slept. You get a replica of one of his ships and where he slept. You've seen that already if you've been watching my videos, but they actually did a nice job of it here. You do not get to see where Columbus actually slept inside this house because this house is no longer like that. You do get a really good museum though. And keep in mind that this museum, Casa de Colon, is on the site of the governor's house where Columbus would have either stayed or liaised, chilled, fraternized. Now let's go and take a look at a painting of King Ferdinand. In Spanish you call it Fernando. King Ferdinand had a heck of a style. Look at that hair. It's like balding at the front, and so then he's pushing it kind of forward. Pretty cool, huh? We don't know if Christopher Columbus looked like this. Painted in 1955. Looks pretty blonde and blue-eyed. Who knows? Queen Isabella, ravishing as ever. Pious as ever. Probably the best maps I've ever seen, which detail his voyages and the direction of the wind. The little markers show the direction of the wind. Every twist and turn is included for all 4 of the voyages. This place definitely did the best job of anywhere that I've been to on this journey of showing detailed maps of everything about Christopher Columbus and all of the voyages that he took. First, you can see everywhere that he went before all of this. All of his journeys that he took before he even met Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand and decided to sail westward to look for the Indies. Then you can see all of his 4 voyages that he sailed for Spain in detail. His first voyage is in red. His second voyage here in blue. The third voyage in yellow. And the last of Columbus's voyages to the New World, the 4th voyage, in green. You can also see a great map showing the winds of the Atlantic Ocean. The arrows that show you which direction the wind goes show you why Columbus took the route that he took. You also get to see a nice map showing how the Pope divided up the discoveries of the New World between Portugal and Spain. So another really cool thing about this museum is the documents section. Now, these are not the original documents because those are kept in libraries and archives in the Americas and in Spain, but they are exact replicas. That, I think that's really cool because basically someone took the time to make them exactly like you would find them in a library, but you have access to all of them right here. So you can see exactly what Columbus's journal entries would have looked like. You can see what the capitulations would have looked like, the agreement that Columbus made with the king and queen. An exact replica of the world-famous Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between the 2 great powers at the time, Portugal and Spain. And over here, you have some of the documents that laid out how to rule the New World. The laws of Burgos, and the treatment that Queen Isabella wanted for the Indians, although, of course, that never happened. But you can see what it looked like right here. In the basement is a really nice cellar from hundreds of years ago, and you also get to see a lot of pre-Columbian artifacts. Now, I love pre-Columbian artifacts, but I didn't come here to the Gran Canaria to see the pre-Columbian artifacts. I can go to Mexico and some of the great museums in the New World to see those. So I'm not going to spend any time on those right now. But you can also go upstairs here and see some great Spanish artwork from the time. Another thing that they did here, which is pretty cool, is you get to see, because there was so much exchange between the Canaries and the Americas. And remember, the Canary Islands were part of the route to the Americas, part of that transatlantic network, because of the trade winds. And also, just like the reason why Hollywood boomed in the United States, people were trying to avoid patents and copyrights. It was far enough away from Spain that they could get away with more stuff. So it was the perfect starting point to go to the New World. Because of that, there are Canary Islanders living all over the world, and something they did a good job with here on this map is showing the major migrations of the Canary Island people to different parts of the world. Bacalar, which you've seen in some of my other videos. Campeche, apparently they founded the city of San Antonio, Texas. So a nice little touch here in the museum called Casa de Colon. This is really cool, an actual globe from 1492. Now, of course, this is it's a replica. They call it a facsimile. That's why hopefully it was okay to touch it and spin it a little bit. But this is what the globe in 1492 would have looked like. Of course, it's missing the Americas. They had not been discovered yet by Columbus, so very nice touch in this museum. Some of you are probably wondering, why is there a globe? I thought that Columbus discovered that the world was round, but he didn't. It was widely known at the time that the world was round. It just wasn't widely known that there was a continent between Europe and Asia. Catalan world map. Europe and Spain over here. Here we are in the Canaries. Barely themselves existing on the world map at the time. This entire courtyard wouldn't have been here, but maybe some of the elements. It's a beautiful place to say goodbye to the Casa de Colon and head over to the cathedral. Remember, the cathedral was not here at the time of Columbus, but it's still an amazing sight to see here in the Las Palmas city of Gran Canaria, so we can't miss it. Behind me stands one of the most beautiful edifices here in Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. It actually didn't exist at the time of Columbus, but it's beautiful anyway. It's an original stone, is not painted green. That stone is called trichyte, and it's from another side of the island. It looks exactly like that. It was mined and created into that doorway, which is the alfiz style for you architecture aficionados. Another feature of this square is the fountain. Remember, fountains were very important at the time because if you were rich, you had a well or a spring in the middle of your own courtyard. But if you were poor, you didn't. The only access you would have had to clean drinking water would have been from the public fountain. Behind me is pretty much the only road in La Vegeta, which is the old city, that would have gone straight to the ocean. And it comes right from the ocean up to the cathedral, which is behind me. You can see the back of the cathedral here, right next to the museum Casa de Colon, which means Columbus's house. From here, I'm gonna take you to the front of the cathedral and inside the cathedral and on top of the cathedral with breathtaking views of the city of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. Now you're probably wondering, was this cathedral here at the time of Christopher Columbus? When Christopher Columbus stayed here while he was fixing his ships? It was not. It had barely begun to be built. It took 400 years to build this magnificent cathedral. It wasn't even in use until probably the 18 or 1900s. So definitely not much to do with Christopher Columbus, but one of the top and most beautiful attractions here in Las Palmas is absolutely a must-see. So we're gonna go inside. Let's go starting from the back and we'll walk all the way around through this beautiful old town neighborhood called La Vegeta. As we stroll through La Vegeta, you will notice some of these beautiful balconies that are, of course, striking to the eye of anyone who's American. We don't have, of course, anything like that with that solid facade and the beautiful little Evita type balconies sticking off the edge. But those balconies were actually a major status symbol at the time. Your wealth and your prestige was being displayed by how big your balcony was. So inches mattered. You can see those balconies are not that big. So a couple extra inches on your balcony, you were really important badass. Really a beautiful, beautiful old town. I'd never really heard of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria as a historical destination before I started researching it for this Path of Columbus video series. But I'm really glad that I did come upon it because it is a very well preserved historic area. At the time of Columbus, there was hardly anything here. It was a very little walled city. It had only been conquered 9 years before, but there were some homes and there were some streets. So even though subsequent years things were built over and around it and expanded, you will probably find, if you were really looking, a good archaeologist, some of the stones from some of these houses might have been a part of the original houses. Some of the doors might be from the late 1400s or 1500s. So you're basically wandering through a city full of elements from a time long gone by. And for me, that has been a really, really rich and wonderful experience. So I'm at the back of the cathedral. I'm gonna shut up for a minute and walk past two supposedly very good tapas restaurants to get to the front and pay my way inside the Cathedral. So now we have rounded the corner and voila, there it is, the epic Cathedral of Las Palmas. Let's get a closer look. Alas, the most popular tourist spot here in La Vegeta, which is the Old Town neighborhood of the capital of Gran Canaria. Behind me you can see the dog statues. See that one right there? Several dog statues. Remember, Canary Islands were not named after the Tweety bird. They were named after cane, which is Latin and Italian for dog. This is the central square. It has been the central square since close to the foundation of the city. Behind me is the city hall. Next to it is the Regent's Palace, which is where the representative of the royalty would have lived. Directly behind me right now is the Episcopal Palace, the seat of power of the church, and of course, the cathedral, which wasn't finished for 400 years. Let's go see 400 years worth of construction inside this epic New World cathedral. Wow, I wanted to really get my first impressions right away. It is massive inside and really, really beautiful. So I just found out that if you keep climbing by foot after you get up the elevator, you can even get higher and see more of the city. Ooh, that's a nice little bell tower there too, look at that. Burn some calories for a nice dinner tonight. So not only is this a really beautiful cathedral, but you get an amazing view of the entire town if you come upstairs. It makes it worth the price. Look at that, you can see everything. There are no guides in this cathedral, so you have no idea what you're looking at, and there's supposed to be an audio guide. The audio guide wasn't working, asked 3 different people, couldn't get it to work. It's supposed to be on your phone, through the internet, totally didn't work. Nobody in the whole entire cathedral was able to get it to work, but they basically just said, sorry, we told you there was a guide, there isn't, no refund offered. So I thought a really amazing cathedral with a really, really horribly backward customer service attitude. Overall, I'm gonna say it's worth it. So if you're talking about Christopher Columbus and the history of Christopher Columbus, one of the first questions that comes up was he a hero? Was he smart? Was he brave? Well, hero is extremely subjective. This day and age, I'm not going to attempt to answer it. Was he smart? Well, he was wrong about how far away India and Japan were. Other people at the time were right. They knew better than him. So he definitely was not the most intelligent, learned, or scientific man at the time. But he probably had a very, very high degree of emotional intelligence, and he definitely had something which has been shown in recent psychological studies to be a key determinant of success, and that is grit. Grit and perseverance, and the ability to follow through on your dreams even though they're misguided. You know, they always say shoot for the moon, and even if you miss it, you'll end up amongst the stars. Well, that's what he did. He missed what he was shooting for and ended up perhaps with something even better. I want to also make some important points to those of you that are watching that don't want anything to do with Columbus or don't want to hear about Columbus because he was an old white man who exploited indigenous peoples. He was a white man, he was a European, and he did exploit indigenous peoples. But we're still exploiting people today, you and I, because the materials that are used to make the smartphone or probably even the flat screen TV that you're watching this on were mined by child slaves in Africa, and basically nobody cares. Apple and Samsung and all the companies throw their hands up and say there's no responsibility. So I'm not gonna get into an in-depth, politically nuanced discussion, but I do want to say to any of you out there who may say we should have no interest in Columbus because he was a bad person, well, those moral things are extremely relative, and we are not such great people today if we're comparing to the exploitation of people that don't have as much as we do, because we're doing it with the shirts that we wear, we're doing it with the phones that we make, and then of course, if you're not a vegetarian, you're basically participating in a lot of bad stuff happening to these animals. And if you've been watching my videos, you know that I am not a vegetarian. I want to take a little bit of the moral component out of it for a minute so that we can take a step back and look at what really happened at the time of Christopher Columbus, why it happened, and what were the ramifications for the world today, because I think that understanding is the most important thing. So I'll continue the rest of my walk around La Vegueta, which is the historic village, most of which was built after Columbus. But let's take some time to think about these things, how the world changed, why it changed, and how our own world is changing today, and what are the implications of that going to be 400 years from now. I'm Toby Nomad, and I will see you in the next adventure coming up very soon on the second island that Columbus stopped on, where he met a lovely lady that he spent some time with in a tower. We'll get into a little bit of that suspicious activity in the next video.